On a humid evening in late summer, 48 years after the birth of Christ, a palace slave named Thrasus stood trembling in the servants' corridor of the imperial palace on Rome's Palatine Hill, staring at a sealed wooden tablet that had just been pressed into his hands by a eunuch he'd never seen before. The tablet bore no markings, no indication of who had sent it or what it contained, but the eunuch had whispered 3 words before disappearing back into the labyrinth of palace passages. The Empress summons. Thrasus felt his stomach turn to ice. He was 19 years old, Greek by birth, sold into slavery at 14 after his father's bankruptcy, purchased by an imperial purchasing agent 3 years ago for his literacy and his discretion. In his time serving the imperial household, he had learned the first rule of palace survival. Avoid the attention of powerful people. Powerful people were dangerous. Their whims could elevate a slave to a position of comfort and privilege, or could end a slave's life on a moment's notice. And no one in the palace was more dangerous than the Empress Valeria Messalina. Thrasus had never spoken directly to the Empress. He had seen her, of course. Everyone in the palace had seen her, moving through the corridors with an entourage of attendants. Beautiful in a way that seemed almost aggressive, her auburn hair elaborately styled, her clothing always the finest silk, her jewelry catching the light as she walked. But he had been careful never to be noticed by her, never to be in a position where she might actually see him as an individual rather than as part of the anonymous mass of palace servants. Now she had summoned him specifically by name, and Thrasus understood with the clarity that comes from pure terror that his life had just become very complicated and very dangerous. He broke the seal on the tablet with shaking hands. The message inside was brief. Come to the private chambers sunset. Tell no one. Wear your plainest clothing. P. The signature was a single letter, but Thrasus knew who P was. Everyone in the palace knew about Phoebe, the Greek freed woman who served Messalina's personal attendant and who was widely rumored to manage the Empress's most delicate arrangements. Arrangements that, according to palace gossip, whispered in corners and never spoken aloud in public spaces, involved matters that would destroy anyone if they became widely known. As the sun began to set, painting the Roman sky in shades of orange and purple, Thrasus made his way to the section of the palace where the imperial family's private chambers were located. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Why would the Empress summon him? What could she possibly want with a junior slave who worked in the administrative offices copying correspondence? Had he done something wrong, violated some rule he didn't know existed? Was he about to be accused of theft or incompetence? Would he be beaten, sold to a worse master, executed? When he reached the designated doorway, he found Phoebe waiting. She was a woman of perhaps 35, attractive in a severe way, dressed in expensive clothing that marked her elevated status as the Empress's personal attendant. She looked Thoris up and down with eyes that seemed to catalogue and assess every detail, then smiled. A smile that did nothing to ease his fear, because it suggested she found his nervousness amusing. "You're Thrasis," she said. "Not a question, a statement. You read and write Greek and Latin. You've been with the household for 3 years. You're literate, discreet, and intelligent enough to follow complex instructions. The Empress has a task for you tonight." Thoris managed to nod, his mouth too dry to speak. Fu's smile widened slightly. "You will accompany her into the city. You will wear civilian clothes. I have garments for you here. You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will not reveal her identity to anyone you encounter under any circumstances. You will observe everything that happens, but you will discuss nothing you witness with anyone ever for any reason. Do you understand what happens to slaves who fail to keep the Empress's secrets?" Thrasus nodded again. He understood perfectly. Slaves who betrayed imperial confidences disappeared. Sometimes their bodies were found floating in the Tiber. Sometimes they simply vanished and were never mentioned again, as though they had never existed. "Good," Phoebe said. She handed him a bundle of clothing, a simple tunic, a common cloak, sandals that had seen better days. "Change into these. Wait here. The Empress will come shortly." Thrasis changed quickly, his fingers fumbling with unfamiliar fastenings. The clothing was deliberately shabby, the kind worn by freed men or poor citizens, completely unlike the neat slave tunic he normally wore in the palace. When he was dressed, Phoebe inspected him critically, adjusted his cloak, and nodded with satisfaction. "You look sufficiently ordinary. Now remember, whatever you see tonight, your life depends on your discretion." They waited in silence for perhaps 15 minutes, though it felt like hours to Thoris. Then he heard footsteps, and 2 women entered the corridor. One was Phoebe's counterpart, another of Messalina's attendants. The other, dressed in a plain stola with a common cloak over it, and her distinctive auburn hair completely covered by a dark hood, was unmistakably the Empress. Even in common clothing, there was something about Messalina that marked her as extraordinary. Perhaps it was the way she moved with complete confidence and a kind of predatory grace. Perhaps it was her face, beautiful even without the elaborate cosmetics she wore in public. Her features sharp and intelligent, her eyes gleaming with what Thoris would later recognize as excitement. She looked at Thoris briefly, assessing him the same way Phoebe had, then nodded. "He'll do," she said. Her voice was cultured, educated, the accent marking her as aristocratic despite the common clothing. "Let's go. I want to be there before full dark." And so Thoris found himself walking through the darkening streets of Rome, following 2 steps behind the Empress of Rome and her attendant Phoebe, moving steadily away from the Palatine Hill where the wealthy and powerful lived, down into the valleys where the common people made their homes. They moved through the Forum, busy even at this hour, with merchants closing their shops and citizens conducting last-minute business. They passed temples and public buildings where Thoris had never been. They entered neighborhoods he had never visited, areas where the apartment buildings, the insul rose 4 and 5 stories high, where the streets narrowed and became crowded, where the smell of cooking food and human waste and incense from household shrines mixed into the distinctive odor of urban poverty. They were heading, Thoris realized with growing unease, into the Suburra. The Suburra was Rome's most notorious district, a dense warren of narrow streets and tall buildings, where the working poor lived in cramped conditions, where crime was rampant, where women sold companionship openly and brazenly, where taverns and gambling dens and worse places operated freely. Respectable people did not go to the Suburra after dark. Women of good family did not go to the Suburra at all, and the Empress of Rome certainly did not go to the Suburra, except she did. Messalina seemed to know exactly where she was going, moving through the twisting streets with confidence, occasionally glancing at street corners or landmarks to orient herself, but never showing any hesitation or uncertainty. She had been here before, Thoris realized, multiple times probably. This was not a desperate flight or a dangerous adventure. This was a routine that Messalina had established, a pattern she followed regularly. They reached their destination after perhaps 30 minutes of walking, a building that looked like any other in the Suburra, unremarkable except for a red lantern hanging beside the door. The red lantern was a universal signal in Rome, marking a building as a house of ill-repute, a place where women sold companionship and where men came to purchase private entertainment. Thoris felt his fear spike into something approaching panic. Why was the Empress of Rome bringing him to such an establishment? Phoebe knocked on the door in a specific pattern. 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 1 knock. The door opened immediately, revealing a large man with the scarred face of someone who had worked as an enforcer or guard. He looked at Phoebe, then at Messalina, and his expression shifted from professional weariness to something like recognition mixed with fear. He stepped aside without a word, gesturing them inside. The interior of the house was dimly lit by oil lamps, the light flickering and creating moving shadows on the walls. The main room held benches and cushions, where clients could wait or negotiate with the women who worked there. Several women were present, dressed in short tunics that exposed their legs and arms, their faces painted with cosmetics, their hair styled in ways meant to attract male attention. They looked up when the door opened, assessed the newcomers, and returned to their conversations, except for one older woman who rose and approached immediately. This woman was perhaps 50, heavy-set, her face showing the remnants of beauty now faded, her clothing more expensive than the working women wore. She was clearly the owner or manager of the establishment. She bowed slightly to Messalina, not the deep bow she would give to a recognized empress, but a gesture of respect that suggested she knew who her visitor was and understood the need for discretion. "My lady," the woman said quietly, "your usual room is prepared. Will you require? She glanced at Thrasus. The full arrangements? Messalina nodded. The full arrangements? I'll be here until dawn. She looked at Thrasus directly for the first time since leaving the palace, and her eyes held something he couldn't quite identify. Amusement, excitement, challenge. This one is just an observer tonight. He's here to learn what discretion means. Position him where he can see, but won't interfere. The establishment's keeper nodded and gestured to a corner of the room, where a small stool stood partially obscured by a column. There, she said to Thrasus, sit there. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't interfere no matter what you see. Understood? Thraces, Saturday. He understood nothing, but he understood that he had no choice but to obey. What Thrasus witnessed over the next 6 hours would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because of the shock value alone, though that was considerable. Not because of the degradation involved, though that was profound, but because of what it revealed about the woman who ruled Rome from behind her husband's throne, about the psychology of power corrupted absolutely, about how someone given everything could still need more, could still crave transgression for transgression's sake.